In 1817, the state of New York asked 10,000 men to do something that had never been done in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Dig a ditch 363 miles long, 40 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. Through forests no European had ever mapped. Through swamps that would kill hundreds. Through solid limestone that would shatter their tools and break their bodies. They had no steam shovels, no bulldozers, no dynamite. Just shovels, axes, wheelbarrows, and their own 2 hands. And they did it in 8 years. What those men carved through the wilderness of upstate New York would transform a young nation. It would make New York City the greatest port in the Western world. It would open the American interior to settlement and commerce. It would prove that a democracy could accomplish what kings and emperors only dreamed of. But that triumph was purchased with something we rarely talk about: the bodies of workers buried in unmarked graves along the towpath, the Irish immigrants who died by the hundreds in fever swamps, the men crushed by falling rock, drowned in sudden floods, killed by blasting accidents years before anyone understood how to safely use explosives. This is the story of how America dug 363 miles of canal by hand before steam shovels existed. And this is the story of the men who paid for that achievement with their lives. To understand why anyone would attempt something this insane, you need to understand what America looked like in the early 1800s. Picture the country as it existed then. 13 states hugging the Atlantic coast like barnacles on a rock. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains stretched a vast interior that might as well have been on the moon. If you wanted to move a barrel of flour from the Ohio Valley to the markets in Philadelphia, here's what you faced. 3 weeks of travel by wagon over roads that weren't really roads, mud in the spring that could swallow a wheel to its axle, dust in summer that choked horses and blinded drivers, rivers to ford, mountains to cross, and at every mile, the cost mounted. A ton of cargo that cost $10 to ship across the Atlantic Ocean cost $120 to haul 300 miles overland. The math was simple and brutal. Farmers in Ohio could grow wheat cheaper than farmers in New York. But by the time that wheat reached an eastern port, the transportation cost had eaten every penny of profit. The American interior was economically worthless because there was no way to move what it produced. Cities like Buffalo, Cleveland, and Detroit would never grow beyond frontier outposts unless someone solved the transportation problem. And in 1800, there was only one proven solution: canals. The technology was ancient. The Egyptians had built canals 4,000 years ago. The Chinese Grand Canal had been moving goods for centuries. European nations had connected their rivers with artificial waterways since the Renaissance. But no one had ever attempted what New York was proposing: 363 miles through wilderness. A 568-foot elevation change. No trained engineers, no precedent, no real certainty that it could be done at all. Or enter DeWitt Clinton. Clinton was a man who thought in scales that made his contemporaries uncomfortable. As mayor of New York City, he had pushed for public education, city infrastructure, and commercial expansion. As a state senator, he developed an obsession that would define his life. He became convinced that New York's future depended entirely on connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. When he first proposed the idea publicly, the response was mockery. His enemies called it Clinton's folly, Clinton's ditch, a lunatic fantasy that would bankrupt the state and accomplish nothing. Thomas Jefferson himself approached for federal funding, called the project little short of madness. Virginia and Pennsylvania lobbied against it, recognizing that a successful canal would destroy their own economic advantages. But most of New York's political establishment thought Clinton had finally gone too far. But Clinton understood something his critics missed. The nation that controlled transportation from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic would dominate the North American economy for a century. The Great Lakes sat at the heart of a network of rivers and waterways that reached deep into the continent. Control the connection to the Atlantic, and you controlled the American interior. If New York didn't build the canal, Pennsylvania or Virginia eventually would. Someone was going to capture this prize. Clinton was determined it would be New York. In 1817, after years of political maneuvering, the New York State Legislature authorized $7 million for construction. To put that in perspective, the entire federal budget in 1817 was about $22 million. New York was betting roughly 1/3 of what the national government spent in a year on a project that might not work. Ground broke on July 4th, 1817, near the town of Rome in central New York. Governor Clinton turned the first ceremonial shovel of earth. Speeches were given, cannons were fired, and then the dignitaries went home, leaving behind the men who would actually do the work. That's when the reality of what they'd committed to hit everyone involved. The men who designed the Erie Canal were not engineers. America didn't have engineering schools in 1817. West Point taught military engineering, but civilian infrastructure was an afterthought. The men who would eventually be called the canal's chief engineers were surveyors, lawyers, and judges who happened to be interested in mathematics. Benjamin Wright had been a surveyor in Oneida County. James Geddes had been a county judge and salt manufacturer. Neither had ever built anything larger than a mill dam. They learned canal engineering by studying the few technical books available, visiting a small canal project in Middlesex, England, and essentially making up the rest as they went. Think about that for a moment. The largest infrastructure project in the Western Hemisphere was designed by self-taught amateurs who were learning on the job. Every lock, every aqueduct, every mile of channel was an experiment. When something failed, and things failed constantly, they had to invent solutions with the materials at hand. But the real story of the Erie Canal isn't the engineers, it's the men who actually dug it. And those men faced challenges that would make modern construction workers quit on the first day. The first crews were local farmers, recruited from the surrounding countryside with promises of steady wages. They earned 50 cents to $1 a day, plus room and board. Room meant a crowded shanty with no floors, no windows, and gaps in the walls that let in rain and cold. Board meant whatever food the contractors could provide cheaply, which was often spoiled, sometimes wormy, and rarely sufficient for the calories they were burning. The work was brutally simple: dig, load, haul, repeat. Imagine standing in a trench 4 feet deep, 6 o'clock in the morning, holding a shovel that weighs 8 pounds empty. The earth you're cutting through has never been turned in human memory. Roots snake through it. Stones hide in it. The blade jars against obstacles you can't see until you've hit them. You fill your shovel, 30 pounds of earth. You twist and heave, throwing it into a wheelbarrow 6 feet away. The wheelbarrow man waits, covered in dirt, watching you work. When his barrow is full, he pushes 150 pounds up a plank to the embankment and dumps it. Then he comes back. You're still shoveling. 10 hours of this, maybe 12, 6 days a week, month after month, in heat that could reach 90 degrees or cold that froze the sweat to your skin. By the end of a shift, your hands are blistered. The skin between your thumb and forefinger is cracked and bleeding. Your back is a single knot of pain that won't fully ease before you have to start again tomorrow. Your shoulders feel like they've been beaten with clubs. And you've moved perhaps 3 cubic yards of earth, one man's daily contribution to a project that required moving 7 million cubic yards total. The soil varied wildly along the route. Some sections were soft loam that yielded to the blade like butter. The workers called these stretches gifts from God. They could move quickly, make their quotas, finish early. Other sections were dense clay that stuck to everything. Every few minutes, you had to stop and scrape your shovel clean, scrape your boots clean, scrape the wheelbarrow clean. The clay clung to metal like it was trying to pull the tools into the earth. Progress slowed to a crawl. Still other sections were swamp. The Montezuma Marshes would become infamous, but there were smaller wetlands scattered along the entire route. In these places, men worked in water up to their waists. The mud sucked at their legs with every step. Mosquitoes descended in clouds thick enough to darken the air. The smell of rotting vegetation was constant, inescapable, nauseating. And then there was the forest. The canal route passed through some of the densest old-growth forest in North America. Trees that had been growing since before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. White pines that soared 150 feet toward the sky. Oaks with trunks so thick that 4 men couldn't link hands around them. Maples, hickories, elms, a cathedral of wood that blocked out the sun and seemed to mock the small figures hacking at its edges. Before a single shovel could break ground, those trees had to come down. Cutting a mature tree with an axe is not like what you see in cartoons. It's not a few dramatic swings in timber. It's hours of work. Strategic notching, careful attention to where the tree will fall. One mistake and the tree falls wrong, crushing whoever's nearby or tangling in other trees so it can't be removed. The axemen worked in teams, felling timber from dawn to dusk. The crash of falling trees became the constant soundtrack of the Canal corridor. Every crash was a small earthquake, the impact shaking the ground 50 feet in every direction. Birds fled in screaming clouds. Deer bolted through the underbrush. The animals could sense what was happening. Their world was ending. But getting the trees down was only half the problem. The stumps remained, and the roots spread 20 feet in every direction, deep into the soil. Each stump had to be ripped from the ground before digging could begin. If you've ever tried to remove a tree stump from your backyard with a shovel, multiply that difficulty by about 1,000. These weren't ornamental maples. These were century-old hardwoods with root systems that had been gripping the earth since George Washington was a child. Here's where necessity became the mother of invention. A contractor named Jeremiah Brainerd designed a device that would become legendary along the canal. Picture a massive wheel, 16 feet in diameter, mounted on an axle supported by a wooden frame. A heavy cable attached to the stump on one end and wound around the axle on the other. A team of horses, sometimes as many as 8, walked in a circle around the mechanism, turning the wheel and slowly winding the cable. The mechanical advantage was immense. The horses walking at 2 miles an hour translated into thousands of pounds of vertical force on the stump. Roots snapped like gunshots, the earth groaned and buckled, and slowly, inevitably, the stump surrendered, tearing free in an explosion of dirt and rock. They called it the stump puller. One device could extract 40 stumps a day. Work that would have taken a crew of 20 men a week with shovels and axes could be done in hours. The stump puller became one of the first labor-saving machines developed specifically for American conditions. But machines couldn't solve every problem, and the biggest problem was coming. About 60 miles east of the canal's midpoint lay a stretch of territory that workers called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Its official name was the Montezuma Marshes, a vast wetland stretching for miles along the Seneca River, thick with cattails and sedge grass, buzzing with insects, and saturated with standing water that had been stagnating since the last ice age. The canal had to go through it. The engineers studied alternatives for months. There was no economical route around it. Going north added 60 miles, going south meant cutting through solid rock escarpments. The only option was straight through the swamp. In the summer of 1819, work crews entered the Montezuma Marshes. The conditions were unlike anything they'd encountered before. The ground wasn't solid. Every step sank ankle-deep into black muck that smelled like rotting eggs. The water wasn't clear. It was tea-colored, stained by decaying vegetation, clouded with particles of organic matter. The air wasn't fresh. It was thick, humid, and flavored with the sweetish stench of decomposition that coated the back of your throat and made food taste wrong. The mosquitoes were beyond anything the workers had experienced. Not just annoying, not just itchy. Clouds of them, dense enough to look like smoke, attacking every inch of exposed skin. Men wrapped their faces in cloth to breathe. They lit smudge fires and worked in the smoke, preferring stinging eyes to the constant assault of the insects. Within weeks, they started dying. The disease announced itself with a chill. A man would wake in his shanty feeling cold despite the August heat. He'd think nothing of it, maybe a draft in the night. But by mid-morning, the chills would intensify. His teeth would chatter even as sweat beaded on his forehead. By afternoon, the fever would spike. 103, 104, and sometimes higher. The man would be too weak to work, too disoriented to walk straight. His skin would flush red, then turn pale, then flush again. He'd complain of headaches that felt like his skull was being squeezed in a vice. By nightfall, he'd be delirious, talking to people who weren't there, crying out for his mother or his wife, thrashing against blankets that felt like they were soaked in ice water even though he was burning alive. If he was lucky, the fever would break by morning. He'd wake drenched in sweat, weak as a kitten, but alive. He might recover in a few days. He might relapse the following week, but he'd survive. If he wasn't lucky, and many weren't, he'd be dead within days. They called it Genesee fever, after the nearby river, or marsh fever, or the ague, or simply the shakes. We know it today as malaria, carried by the Anopheles mosquitoes that bred by the millions in the stagnant water. No one in 1819 understood this. The germ theory of disease was decades away. Doctors blamed the illness on miasma, bad air rising from the swamp. They called it a product of rotting vegetation, of noxious gases, of the simple unhealthiness of wet places. They prescribed quinine, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree. It actually worked, though no one knew why. The quinine killed the malaria parasites in the blood, reducing fever and allowing recovery. Men who received quinine early enough usually survived. They also prescribed bloodletting, drawing pints of blood from patients who were already weak and dehydrated. This did not work. It made things dramatically worse. Men who might have survived with rest alone were pushed over the edge by well-meaning doctors draining what little strength remained. In the summer and fall of 1819, over 1,000 workers fell ill in the Montezuma Marshes alone. Some estimates put the number closer to 2,000. The death toll is impossible to calculate precisely. Records were incomplete. Workers came and went without documentation. The bodies of dead laborers, especially immigrants without family nearby, were often buried quickly and forgotten. Conservative estimates suggest several hundred dead. Other historians believe the true number exceeded 1,000 in that single season. Either way, it was a catastrophe. Work in the marshes ground to a halt. Men fled the camps, preferring unemployment to death. Those who stayed were too few and too weak to make progress. Contractors begged for replacement workers and found no takers. Word had spread. The Montezuma Marshes were a graveyard. Stay away. The Canal Commission faced the real possibility that the project would have to be abandoned. $7 million already spent. Hundreds of lives lost, and the possibility of complete failure staring them in the face. But they didn't abandon it. They adapted. Work schedules shifted. Crews would work only in the cooler months, from October to May, when mosquitoes were dormant. Summer operations in the marshes were suspended entirely. The project would take longer, but workers would survive. Drainage ditches were dug alongside the main canal channel. As the canal bed was excavated below the water table, it pulled groundwater from the surrounding area, lowering the saturation level and reducing standing water where mosquitoes could breed. The workers were accidentally draining the swamp as they built the canal through it. Smudge fires burned constantly in the work camps. The smoke drove off some of the insects, though no one understood why exactly. They just knew that men who worked near fires got bitten less, and new workers arrived to replace the dead. Immigrants from Ireland, fresh off the ships in New York Harbor, willing to work for wages that American-born laborers had begun to reject. The Irish workers who built the Erie Canal deserve more than the footnote history usually gives them. They were desperate men, fleeing desperate circumstances. In the years following the Napoleonic Wars, Ireland's economy had collapsed. British trade restrictions, absentee landlords, and population pressure had created poverty so grinding that America's most dangerous jobs looked like opportunity. These men arrived in New York Harbor with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had no connections, no skills that translated to urban employment, and no way to return home. When labor contractors appeared on the docks offering canal work, they signed up by the hundreds. The wages were lower than what local workers had demanded. 50 cents a day instead of $1. The conditions were the same. The death rate was the same. But the Irish took the jobs because they had no alternative. They lived in shanty towns along the canal route, rough shelters thrown together from scrap wood and canvas, crowded with men sleeping shoulder to shoulder on beds of straw. The shacks leaked rain, let in cold, and offered no protection from disease. Sanitation was non-existent. Food was whatever the contractors provided, often spoiled, never enough. And they died in numbers that will never be accurately counted. The Irish workers were treated as disposable. When one died, another was available at the docks. When disease swept through a work camp, contractors relocated operations to a new section and left the sick to recover or die on their own. The bodies were buried quickly, without ceremony or marker, in graves that have long since been lost. Along certain stretches of the canal today, you're walking over the bones of Irishmen who never lived to see the waterway completed. Their names are lost. Their families back in Ireland often never knew what happened to them. And they sent sons across the Atlantic, and those sons simply vanished into the maw of a nation building itself. There were no death certificates for most of these men, no compensation for their families, no acknowledgement that they had existed at all. They were simply absorbed into the machinery of progress and consumed by it. But the marshes weren't the only killing ground. 50 miles to the west, another challenge waited, one that would require a different kind of sacrifice. The canal's western terminus was the village of Buffalo on the shore of Lake Erie. Between the easy digging of the central sections and the lake stood a limestone ridge called the Niagara Escarpment, the same geological formation that creates Niagara Falls. At the town of Lockport, the canal had to rise 60 feet in less than a mile. The solution was a flight of locks, a staircase of 5 double locks that would lift boats up the escarpment in stages, each lock raising the water level 12 feet. The engineering was ambitious, the construction was deadly. Before the locks could be built, a channel had to be cut through solid rock. A quarter-mile long, 30 feet deep, 60 feet wide, through limestone that had been forming since before the dinosaurs. This was the deep cut at Lockport. It would become the most dangerous work on the entire Erie Canal project. In 1817, the only way to break rock at scale was black powder, the same explosive compound used in muskets and cannons. It had been employed in mining for centuries, but never at this scale, never this close to workers, and never with anything resembling modern safety protocols. And the process started with drilling. Men worked in pairs, one holding a metal drill rod against the rock face, the other swinging a hammer to drive it in. Each stroke advanced the hole by perhaps 1/8 of an inch. A single hole, 2 inches in diameter and 18 inches deep, took hours to complete. Picture this work. You're standing on a narrow ledge 30 feet above the floor of the cut. The rock wall in front of you is slick with groundwater seepage. Your partner is holding a steel rod against that wall, his hands inches from where your hammer will strike. One missed swing, and you've shattered his fingers. One flinch from him, and the drill jumps, taking skin and flesh with it. The hammer weighs 10 pounds. You swing it overhead and bring it down with everything you have. The impact jars through your shoulders, your spine, your teeth. The ringing sound echoes off the rock walls, overlapping with the sound of a dozen other teams doing the same work, until the air is filled with a constant metallic pulse. You do this for hours. Your arms shake. Your aim wavers. The man holding the drill looks up at you with eyes that are calculating whether you can keep going, whether he should suggest a break, whether the next swing might miss. When enough holes were drilled, the blasting crew moved in. Black powder was poured into each hole, tamped down with wooden or copper rods to avoid sparks. Fuses were inserted, cut lengths of slow-burning cord that would give the workers time to clear the area. In theory, the fuses weren't reliable. Sometimes they burned faster than expected. Sometimes they smoldered out and left the charge unexploded, sitting in the rock like a trap waiting for the next man who struck it with a drill. Sometimes multiple charges were set and lit in sequence, and a gust of wind accelerated one fuse while slowing another, so the explosions came out of order and men who thought they were safe were caught in the blasts. When the powder ignited, the effect was devastating. Thousands of pounds of force concentrated in a few cubic inches. The rock shattered, chunks flying outward like artillery shells. Men were blinded by flying debris. Legs were crushed by falling stones. Skulls were caved in by rocks that fell from the walls above, dislodged by the vibrations of the blast. The explosion was just the beginning. After each blast, Workers had to return immediately to clear the broken rock before another round of drilling began. The rubble was still hot. The dust was thick enough to choke on, and the rock above them was now destabilized, fractured by the blast, waiting to fall. A man named Otis Peck was working the deep cut in the spring of 1823 when a section of the rock face sheared away without warning. 10 tons of limestone came down on his crew. Peck was buried to his waist. 2 men beside him were buried completely. Rescue teams worked for hours, pulling rock by hand, calling out to the trapped men. They got Peck out alive, his legs shattered but still attached. The other 2 they recovered as bodies. Another man, Peter McQueen, was killed later that same year when an even larger collapse occurred. 3,000 tons of limestone gave way, turning a section of the deep cut into a tomb. 5 workers were buried. Rescue teams dug for days. They found the bodies, but nothing else. These accidents were common enough that workers developed their own fatalistic rituals. Some men refused to enter the deep cut without making peace with God. Others said goodbye to their bunkmates each morning as though they might not see them again. Because they might not. The death toll at Lockport was never officially recorded. Estimates range from dozens to over 100. The workers themselves believed the number was higher than the contractors admitted. Dead men didn't have to be paid. The work at Lockport took 3 years. 3 years of drilling, blasting, hauling, and dying. When it was finished, the deep cut was the greatest excavation in American history to that point. Over 1.5 million cubic yards of rock had been removed by hand. The men who accomplished this were not celebrated. They were paid off and sent away. Many never worked again, their bodies broken by years of labor that modern medicine would recognize as catastrophic physical abuse. They vanished into history, replaced by the monument they had carved. But the canal required more than a ditch. It was a water highway, and water follows its own rules. The engineers faced problems that had no established solutions. How do you carry a canal across a river? Rivers flow. Their levels rise and fall with rain and snowmelt. The canal needed to remain still, its water level constant. If the canal simply crossed a river at grade level, the river would sweep through and destroy everything downstream. The answer was aqueducts, bridges that carried water instead of roads. The Erie Canal required 18 of them. The largest was the Great Embankment at Irondequoit Creek near Rochester. The creek had carved a 70-foot deep valley through the landscape, and the canal had to cross it. The engineers built a massive earthen dam over 1,000 feet long and 70 feet high, creating an artificial ridge that carried the canal across the gap. Picture the construction: thousands of workers hauling earth in wheelbarrows, building a hill, one load at a time. The base had to be wide enough that the weight could be supported. The slopes had to be gentle enough that erosion wouldn't tear the structure apart. The whole thing had to be watertight, so the canal could hold water 1,000 feet in the air. The Great Embankment took 2 years to construct. It used over 500,000 cubic yards of earth carried by hand from surrounding excavations. Every wheelbarrow load pushed up a plank. When every basket of dirt dumped and tamped down, a mountain built by human muscle. If the embankment failed, the weight of water behind it would surge down into Irondequoit Creek, taking everything in its path. Houses, farms, people. The stakes were impossible to ignore. It didn't fail. It still stands today, carrying the modern barge canal across the same valley. A monument to the possibility of building things that last. But not everything succeeded on the first try. In October 1822, a section of canal embankment near Syracuse collapsed without warning. The breach sent a wall of water cascading through surrounding farmland, destroying crops, killing livestock, and narrowly missing several workers camped nearby. The embankment had been built on unstable soil, underlain by deposits of marl that became slippery when saturated. No one had known until the water found the weak point and everything came apart. The engineers studied the failure. They identified the problem. They developed new foundation techniques, driving wooden pilings into soft ground to stabilize the structures. And they rebuilt the embankment using methods that would not fail again. By 1823, the middle section of the canal was complete and operating. Boats were already carrying cargo between Utica and the Seneca River. Farmers were getting wheat to market faster and cheaper than ever before. The revenue was encouraging. People were starting to believe the impossible project might actually succeed. But the hardest work lay ahead at both ends. To the west, the deep cut at Lockport was still claiming lives. To the east, the canal had to descend from the interior plateau to the Hudson River at Albany. This meant more locks, more excavation, more challenges. The eastern section passed through the Mohawk Valley, following the river that had been the original route of trade between the coast and the interior for thousands of years. But following a river is different from building alongside it. Rivers flood without warning. Rivers undercut their banks and shift their courses. Rivers don't care about human engineering. In the spring of 1824, the Mohawk flooded with unusual violence. Snowmelt combined with heavy rain turned the river into a destructive force that overtopped its banks and swept across the work sites. Workers scrambled to save equipment and their own lives. Sections of completed canal were washed out. Temporary dams were swept away. In months of back-breaking work disappeared overnight. The flood revealed weaknesses in the design. Some sections had been built too close to the river. Some foundations had been too shallow. The engineers had underestimated the Mohawks' capacity for violence. They rebuilt. What else could they do? They moved certain sections farther from the river. They strengthened foundations. They built higher embankments to protect against future floods. And they kept going. By the summer of 1825, the end was finally in sight. The deep cut was finished. The eastern sections were complete. Only a few final miles remained to connect everything into one continuous waterway. The formal opening was scheduled for October, when the canal would be full and the weather still cooperative. But ceremonies don't capture what it felt like to be there. On October 26, some 1825, a cannon was fired at Buffalo on the shore of Lake Erie. The sound signaled that the Erie Canal was officially open. Within minutes, another cannon fired, then another, and another, relaying the message east along the canal route. Town to town, cannon to cannon, the signal raced toward the Atlantic. 81 minutes after that first shot at Buffalo, a cannon fired in New York Harbor. 363 miles in an hour and 21 minutes. Faster than any horse could run. DeWitt Clinton boarded a packet boat called the Seneca Chief and began the journey from Buffalo to the ocean. The boat was decorated with flags and bunting. A band played patriotic music. Behind it came a flotilla of smaller vessels carrying dignitaries, reporters, and well-wishers. As the Seneca Chief passed through each town along the route, crowds gathered to cheer, cannons fired salutes, church bells rang. People who had dismissed the canal as impossible just years before now celebrated it as the greatest achievement of the age. The journey took 10 days. 10 days of receptions, speeches, and celebrations that grew larger as the flotilla approached New York. By the time they reached the harbor, the crowd numbered in the tens of thousands. On November 4th, 1825, Clinton stood at the bow of the Seneca Chief and poured a keg of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean. They called it the Wedding of the Waters. The interior of the continent was now married to the sea. The impact was immediate and transformative. In 1817, it cost $100 to ship a ton of cargo from Buffalo to New York City by wagon. By 1825, the same journey by canal cost $10. Not a marginal improvement, a 90% reduction. Suddenly, farmers in Ohio could compete with farmers in Virginia. Western grain flooded eastern markets, driving down prices for consumers while increasing demand for Western production. The settlement of the Midwest, which had been stalled by transportation costs, exploded. New York City had been one of several competing Atlantic ports before the canal. Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore all handled similar volumes of trade. Within 15 years of the canal's completion, New York handled more commerce than all of them combined. The city's population doubled, then doubled again. Its banking industry grew to dominate American finance. The foundations of modern Wall Street were laid with the profits of canal commerce. So towns along the canal route transformed into cities seemingly overnight. Rochester grew from a village of 1,500 souls in 1820 to over 36,000 by 1840. Syracuse, Buffalo, and Utica followed similar trajectories. The canal didn't just transport goods, it transported possibility. But success has a way of erasing sacrifice. Within a generation, the men who had actually dug the canal were forgotten. Their widows had scattered, their children had grown up hearing stories that seemed incredible, distant, disconnected from the prosperous world growing around them. The Irish workers who died in the Montezuma Marshes left no monuments. The men crushed at Lockport had no statues erected in their memory. The thousands who suffered injuries that ended their working lives received no pensions, no compensation, no recognition. The engineering achievements were celebrated. The political vision was praised. The economic transformation was studied and analyzed by academics who had never lifted a shovel. But the bodies buried along the towpath were quietly forgotten, too inconvenient for a story of triumph. Here is what we know. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 workers died during the canal's construction. The exact number will never be established. The dead were not always recorded, especially if they were immigrants, especially if they died of disease rather than dramatic accident. We know entire work camps were wiped out by malaria. We know explosions and collapses killed men whose names were never written down. We know injuries that would be survivable today were death sentences in an era before antibiotics, before anesthesia, so before anyone understood why wounds became infected. And we know none of these deaths stopped the work. New workers always arrived. The canal had to be finished. Progress demanded its price, and the price was paid in bodies. The Erie Canal operated as a commercial waterway for over a century. Enlarged twice to handle larger boats and greater traffic, it remained a vital artery of commerce until the railroads and then the highways made it obsolete. Today, much of the original canal has been incorporated into the New York State Canal system, used primarily for recreation. Pleasure boats cruise where cargo barges once hauled wheat and lumber. Tourists photograph the same locks that killed men like Peter McQueen 2 centuries ago. If you walk along the towpath today, the path where horses and mules once pulled boats westward, you're walking on history that most Americans have forgotten. The towns still bear names that echo the construction era. The locks at Lockport still operate, though the machinery is modern. The route itself is a monument, stretching across the state like a scar that healed into something useful. But monuments hide as much as they reveal. The Erie Canal transformed America. It proved that a democracy could accomplish engineering feats that matched anything built by kings or emperors. It opened the West to commerce and settlement. It made New York City the greatest city in the nation and one of the greatest in the world. It laid the economic foundations for American prosperity in the 19th century. All of that is true, but it's also true that this transformation was built on the backs of men who are now invisible. On Irish immigrants fleeing starvation, local farmers looking for cash wages, drifters and laborers and desperate men who signed on for dangerous work because they had no better options. These men didn't dig the canal for glory. They dug it for 50 cents a day. They dug it because someone had to. They dug it because the alternative was worse. And when they died, which too many of them did, they were replaced and forgotten. We build our monuments to the architects and the visionaries, to the men who had the ideas, to the politicians who secured the funding. We put their names on plaques and teach their stories in schools. We do not build monuments to the men who actually swung the pickaxes, who pushed the wheelbarrows, who held the drills while their partners swung the hammers, who died in swamps and rockfalls and blasting accidents while the architects slept safely in distant cities. The next time you see a map of New York State, find the line stretching from Albany to Buffalo. That line represents 363 miles of earth moved by shovel, millions of trees felled by axe, millions of tons of rock broken by black powder and cleared by hand. That line represents one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century, accomplished before steam shovels, before dynamite, before bulldozers, before any of the machinery we take for granted today. And that line represents something we rarely discuss, a debt that was never acknowledged, a sacrifice that was never repaid. The bones of forgotten men scattered along a towpath that made a nation rich. They deserve to be remembered, because the canal still carries water from Lake Erie to the Hudson River, though little commercial traffic uses it now. The water still flows east, as it has for 200 years, following the channel that human hands carved through the wilderness. Somewhere along that route, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear them. The ring of hammer on drill steel, the crash of falling trees, the shouts of foremen calling crews to work, the groans of men lifting more than any body should lift day after day, year after year. Somewhere along that route, if you look carefully, you might find remnants. A cellar hole where a work camp once stood, a foundation stone from a contractor's office, a headstone so weathered the name can no longer be read. This is what it cost to build America. Not just money and political will, muscle and bone and blood. The labor of men whose names history did not bother to record. The next time someone tells you that great achievements require great sacrifice, remember this. The sacrifice is rarely made by the people who benefit most. It's made by people like the canal workers, people who did the hardest labor, faced the greatest danger, and received the smallest share of the reward. The Erie Canal stands as a monument to American ambition and American engineering. That's the story we prefer to tell, but it's also a story about who we remember and who we forget, about what we celebrate and what we quietly set aside, about the uncomfortable truth that progress has always demanded a price, and the price has always been paid by someone other than the people holding the ceremonial shovels. 2 centuries later, the canal still flows. The water still moves from lake to sea, and somewhere beneath the towpath, the forgotten men still sleep. This was their story. They deserve to have it told.